for joining us today. David and I are, as Veronica said, with Rush University Medical Center and the system. David covers, I'll let him introduce himself, but covers a lot of issues that relate to immigration, patient rights, a lot of things that sort of intersect with some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. And myself, the legal team and risk team at Rush covers a lot of territory, obviously. But one of the things that we're doing that's most germane to what we're talking about here today is we do a legal and governmental analysis of what's going on. And we've actually at Rush built a team, that regularly continually is looking at what's happening in the government, especially since January, and tracking it, assessing the risk of it, trying to interpret what's going on, and then assessing what the impact might be to Rush. Obviously, I'm not here to talk about Rush or be counsel to anyone, but this is all just educational, informational updates. But I want to give you that kind of background because we're living and breathing this, as everybody is, but from an analysis standpoint, every day. And I overheard some people talking about earlier, sorry, just couldn't hear about it, but about grants getting canceled, about actions being taken against, obviously, universities, law firms. We see it with health systems, et cetera. So it's a very, very challenging time, obviously, and there's a lot of dramatic change going on. And we, at the end of the day, we don't know exactly and we're not here to prognosticate, but we are here to do as much explaining as we can as to sort of what the law is, because that still does exist, and then the realities. And that's how I talk to people at Rush as well, is there's the law that I put a lot of faith in and have a lot of belief in, but then there's political realities of what's going on and how they're intersecting with law. And I think what's really helpful is to understand some of the basics of the law. And here we're going to talk a lot about immigration. I want to be conscious of the time, but I do want to bring up some other things that are going on. Because once you understand some of the legal principles, it's a little bit easier to kind of make sense of it to the extent you can make sense of it, because what's surprising to me until I dug into a lot of these cases is that the administration is as radical as you might look at them and see as what they're doing, and it is, they're still following some law. Their interpretation of it and how they're pushing it is very, very unusual and different from our perspective, maybe conventionally as we would think about it. But it is helpful to understand some of the basics of the law to get at what they're doing and try to make sense of it. And so with that in mind, and before David, you introduce yourself and your background, we're going to talk about immigration. We're going to talk a little bit about the government's approach to DEI and research. I think some of us, as I overheard, but then also what I'm dealing with, we're knee deep in that. Gender issues, all of it has sort of captured headlines because there's been executive orders that have been issued and actions by the government, enforcement actions that encompass all of that. And so, before we get into immigration and any of these things, I wanted to cover a few basic principles, but I'm gonna let David introduce himself and his background.
Yeah, I've been at Rush since 2018 and have been involved with a lot of different projects dealing with on-demand consultations regarding patients' rights. And it's been an amazing ride with respect to my employment at Rush. Prior to that, I was a prosecutor, and so being involved in that field, basically you had to have a lot of knowledge with respect to not only the law, but how the law would apply in particular cases with certain set of facts. And the most important thing I learned during that phase of my life is to make sure that we protect the integrity of that office. And by that, what I mean is it was important for us to always uphold the principle that we gotta make sure there is a fair process and that process is protected throughout the entirety of a case, from the beginning all the way to the disposition at the end. And we are supposed to be the guardian of that process. It's not about getting someone, more so it's about protecting the process to the point where justice, to the best degree possible, is administered for these types of cases. And so I think it's very much applicable here. We want to make sure that there's fairness and that whatever the law is that is applicable to immigration, that fairness is applied throughout all of the cases, the deportation proceedings. We'll see, as Carl will go into some of the cases that are kind of, expository as to what we're talking about today. We will see that there is some misuse of that process, or a lack of process, as we talk about these cases. But I think my background, is really helpful in terms of understanding what the limitations are and where we need to go with all of these issues that we're facing currently. I myself, I'm an immigrant. Back when I was 10, I followed my parents' dreams. Of course, as a 10-year-old, you don't really know why you are moving from one country to the next. You really don't know. You just sort of rely on your parents to provide you with the necessary protections and safeguards, and hope that you're going to be able to live in a country where your parents want to go. And so that's the only mindset that I had back when I was 10. But it was not until much later on in my life where I realized the amount of sacrifice that they made in order for us to come here and live here, to obtain that liberty that America always talks about, and to be given that opportunity, which I think is a human need, right? It's not just for a specific class of individuals, but I think it is a human need for everyone to be able to have that type of liberty and opportunity. My parents sacrificed a lot to obtain that for our family, and forever grateful for giving me that opportunity, which is the reason why I'm here today. I mean, to be given this opportunity to be able to talk about these issues with you. Yeah, I mean, that's it in a nutshell, but yeah.
Yeah, you're shortchanging a lot of his history, but anyway, he's got a very interesting life story. So beyond that, but if you want to talk, we'll leave some time for questions and answers. So what I want to say before we get into the immigration presentation that we have is to just sort of give some context for everything that's going on. Obviously, when the new president got into office, he started signing a bunch of executive orders, and that scared a lot of people. And it should, he's the president of the United States. But one thing that I, as a lawyer, wanted to make sure people understood is that an executive order is not a law. It's just a declaration by the president as to what he wants his administration to do. And so while there was a lot of rhetoric in these executive orders, at the end of the day, most of them were directing the Department of Justice or HHS or some other agency to do something, or to come up with a report or promulgate it. The only way there's going to be a law is if Congress passes something, or if there's a regulation that an agency goes through the legal process of doing. And, actually, there's been very little law or regulation made since Inauguration Day. It's been a lot of EOs. So he's kind of governing by EOs, or executive orders. Some of those executive orders, as you guys all are aware of, there's some that related to immigration, in which he withdrew an executive order to withdraw a Biden executive order, which made sensitive areas protected, such as hospitals, schools, churches, from ICE. He withdrew that, so then that opened the door for ICE to come into those places where previously the FBI or police could have, but ICE wouldn't be able to. Now they could. So that was the first kind of salvo in this, the new administration's efforts relating to immigration. And then he also named some organizations terrorist organizations, right? So there were some gangs that he classified as foreign terrorist organizations. That becomes relevant in what I'll say later. And also talked about things. It's not just in the EOs, but in the EOs and in the way he talked about it, is that these were invading forces, or forces that were trying to invade. This is all very relevant. And honestly, when you look at it, it all ties together as to what he ultimately was trying to do. He also then declared that there was an emergency going on. In fact, he's been declaring that there was an emergency to justify the tariffs that he put in. That was an economic emergency that he's declared. But he has said that these gangs, in particular, present this invading force, and therefore called upon the use of what's called the Alien Enemies Act, which you guys probably have heard about, but I wouldn't have heard about it for a long time, since maybe high school history class, because that's from 1798. It has only been used 3 times in the nation's history, and it was when there was a declared war. That wasn't the case here. We don't have a declared war declared by the Congress war, but he's utilizing that. So again, why I was saying before that if you understand some of the law, you can see there actually are little avenues he's trying to take and his administration is trying to take that have the patina of, or have the nomenclature of the law, but as you were saying, David, when you look and study it a little bit, there's balls that are being dropped, due process that isn't necessarily being followed in all these cases, and that's what is alarming. Actually, all of it can be considered alarming depending on where you are. With regard to one other thing I wanted to say before we get into immigration also is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, there still is a First Amendment, right? And we have the ability to talk about things freely, we should. And saying the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, or talking about those ideas, you know, having programs that deal with those concepts is not illegal. And again, a lot of people might have read those EOs or heard the rhetoric and thought, oh, we can't, you know, use those words. So you saw organizations, both companies and institutions of higher learning, scrubbing their websites, saying we're giving up on this stuff. Now, maybe they were doing it because they never really believed in the stuff to begin with, or maybe they were doing it because they felt that the EO meant something more significant than it did. But if you look at the EOs related to those, it said unlawful DEI. Now, what does that mean? Now, where we come from as lawyers, we want to see those things tested because then a court can give some definition and force the parties to say, what is illegal about the DEI that was being used there? And until that happens, there's a lot of lack of clarity. There's a lot of ambiguity. And so you've heard the expression, don't comply in advance, perhaps. You know, we don't want to guess. You don't want to guess at what the law is, you know, and that's why there is a process in normal times where the Congress would enact a law, there'd be debate, people would try to get to more specificity about what something like that meant. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because speech matters in these immigration cases, as we're gonna see, right? What people have said and what they've written, who they've associated with, all things protected by the First Amendment are becoming relevant in what happens to people relative to ICE. Also, there's the Fourth Amendment. Let's not forget that, right? So I'm just doing a little quick rundown of civics, right? Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. Okay, that means something in normal times, means something now, which means that in most cases, a warrant is needed. It's signed by a judge before ICE or any law enforcement can come in and do a search of your personal belongings or arrest a person, okay? And that still holds. Again, there's still a Fourth Amendment, there's still a First Amendment, and there's also a Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment guarantees us all as persons, not just citizens, so this will be relevant here too, to due process. So before the government can take our liberty, our life, of course, and our property, it has to utilize due process, it has to grant us due process before it can do those things. Again, as David's noting, and we'll get to this, that hasn't always been followed, or at least we can look at it and say, hey, there's some questions here about that. And you know, what's really important, I think, is regardless of whatever your views of this administration are, or the policies or whatever, is we believe we have to take not refuge, we have to guard the process and we have to follow the process, because the process at the end of the day, we may not agree with what comes out at the end of the process, but at least it gives everybody a chance to be heard, and that creates clarity. And that's what I think most people are feeling right now, is we don't have that, right? Now, this DEI stuff in particular, meaning the reaction to it that's going on in 2025, it's really, the source of a lot of that comes from the 2023 case of SFFA versus Harvard. I'm just going to call it the Harvard case. And that Harvard case said that universities cannot use race as a factor in making admissions decisions. That, again, whether you agree with it or not, it's something we heard in the university, and we said, hey, we have to honor that. You know, we abide by the law. So until that law changes or evolves or whatever, which is the nature of law in America, it can evolve, it can change over time, we have to adhere to that. But what that has been is a linchpin for this administration to say, and others, not just the administration, to say, okay, you're not allowed to use race as a factor. Well, you shouldn't use any protected characteristic as a factor, okay? And you guys, I think if you don't know what protected characteristic is, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, age, and religion, importantly. And you're not supposed to, those are just a number of them, but those are things you're not supposed to use. They're called protected characteristics. You're not supposed to use them in, as we saw from the Harvard case, admissions, but you're also not supposed to use them in employment decisions, scholarship decisions, et cetera, and that's set out by the law. Now, what this administration is doing, and people around it who are sympathetic to their view of the world, is that, well, that doesn't mean that just if you're black or if you're Hispanic, that it's protected. It means white people are protected too. Okay, so because white people, Caucasian is a race, so therefore you shouldn't discriminate against them. So when you give somebody an advantage because in employment or admissions because of their ethnicity or their racial background to the disadvantage of another person based on their race, that is illegal, and that would be contrary to the Harvard case, which said, we're talking about Title VII, Title IX, Title VI, et cetera, the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. I'm giving you all this background because I think it's really helpful to start kind of bucketing it, and it has been for me, even as a lawyer, to kind of reacquaint myself with this, even though I work on some of these issues all the time, to sort of see where they were coming from and what they were trying to do. Because then it helps me make sense of it and candidly also talk to my own client about this stuff, meaning the institution, Rush. But why I think it's important for everybody in the room to kind of keep this in mind is that even if you take that understanding of it, that we're not supposed to use race, we're not supposed to use these protected characteristics, that doesn't mean, and even Chief Justice Roberts himself in the opinion, doesn't mean you are race blind. It doesn't mean there can't be efforts to pursue diversity. Certainly doesn't mean we can't pursue equity, because we all know what those things mean. I mean, e pluribus unum, our country is built on diversity. Equity just means fairness under the law. Okay, inclusion is we should all welcome people into whatever organization we're in, whatever community we're in. So these are all legitimate, lawful, and laudable, in my opinion, concepts and goals. And I don't think people should shy away from them or be overly concerned about. We should be concerned given the political realities, but we should take solace in the fact that we still have the First Amendment, we still have the Civil Rights Acts, these things still protect us. And it's easy for me to say that, and another thing for people to live it and hear it, especially if you are a person of color who saw those statutes and those laws as protective of what was going on, not just those programs, but their own identity, to now hear that. But what I like to tell people is, look, characteristics still do matter to people, right? The characteristics, so for instance, this is what Chief Justice Roberts said. And I love using their words because it's, first of all, they have to honor their words, right? Well, if you were, as David, you came up as an immigrant, your ethnic background, racial background, it influenced you. I know this, I can say this, but because I know you very well, but it influenced the life path you chose, the work you did, what commitment you want to give back to your community, but the community at large. And so what Roberts was saying is that can all be considered. It's just that you can't say, well, because David is of a particular race, that he gets an extra point or something, because that's what Harvard was doing, like kind of giving points or something like that. But we could still think of those characteristics about David and the person he became because of it, right? So he became a more resilient person, a person focused on justice and social justice in particular, responsibility. Again, all these things built his character. And so character still matters, and character is developed and forged by your backgrounds, all of our backgrounds, wherever you came from. And so we're not blind to that. So I say that because I want people to understand there's ways of looking at what's done. You can hear what's happening and say, okay, we have to be quiet. We can't talk about any of this stuff. We can't do this stuff. We can't pursue those goals. Not true. The job of the lawyers is to help people understand what those words mean and how to sort of navigate it in a way that's lawful. Because even in the EOs that the president has signed, he says unlawful DEI. That implies there's lawful DEI. And that's going to apply to a lot of the things that we're talking about here. So with that, I want to move to the immigration because that's what we were asked to come here for. But I'm perfectly happy to answer any questions about that towards the end about DEI because it's influenced, back to the grant cancellations. We've had grants canceled at Rush because it's a form letter, actually, and it says it's connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which they consider spurious and non-scientific. Well, if you guys know anything about medicine and science, you know that there are diseases that affect different ethnic or racial groups differently than they affect the other ones. And so when you're doing research, you better be mindful of that stuff. You better be calculated. So you can't do health sciences and medicine without being aware of people's diversity, okay? I mean, think about it this way, even sex, right? A woman's gonna come in and they are susceptible to diseases and treatments and different conditions that men aren't. So of course we have to, it's almost silly to think of it not that way. Yet people hear these words, they say, should I ever be, we get a little scared. And look, it's understandable. When the government and the president of the United States is doing it and you see ICE run around, I know I'm mixing apples and oranges here, but it's well, maybe I better watch it. Maybe I better, So I just want people to understand that there are ways of navigating these things. But by the same token, there are the realities. The realities are they're pushing the limits of this stuff to the extent that they're even pushing it beyond where due process we would think of as lawyers, due process should lead us. So let's go to immigration. This is my clinic, yeah. We're gonna talk about some recent cases, and then we're gonna do some basics on immigration law, just like I did a little con law within 5 minutes there. Now we'll do a little immigration law within 3 minutes. But then we're also gonna talk importantly about the practical and legal aspects of this, because I can say all I want, rah rah the law, or God bless America and stuff, which I do believe, but there's a reality. People don't always abide by the law, and they don't always obey it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the resources that we can have, but we cut that a little bit short. Yeah. So just mindful of time, going to recent immigration cases, if you go to the next one, we have the case, I'll be very quick. There's Dr. Rasha Alawi, which is that she's a Lebanese doctor and professor at Brown who was in Lebanon. And when she came back, she has a H-1B visa, right? So that's a visa, and we'll get into that a little bit later. It's a visa that she's a skilled worker, she's able to work here. In fact, the government set those things up because we wanted more people like that to work. So we were asking for those type of people. Well, it turned out that she went to the funeral of a Hezbollah leader, and her visa then was revoked and she was deported. She wasn't allowed back entry into the country. That's being challenged by her, but she's back in Lebanon as a consequence. And I'll talk a little bit more about the niceties of these cases.
And even in non-compliance to a court order, federal court order.
Right, and we're gonna see a few of these where the court ordered things and the administration is, and what it tends to lean on is, well, that person's no longer here. You heard that one. Oh, they're in El Salvador or whatever. And then as if that absolves them from jurisdiction. Like right there, we have a problem. People throw around constitutional crisis or word. That is constitutionally problematic, obviously, because if the president isn't gonna abide by the court orders, we do have an issue. Now, we haven't gotten to the point where there's been a Supreme Court ruling. And I know I'm sure that's where their thought is, well, we'll see about that district court, or we'll see about that appellate court. But then we all have to see about what he or the administration might do if the Supreme Court rules in a way they don't like. We haven't been there yet. But all these cases might wind up there, okay? There's the Garcia case. So Kilmar Garcia is that married individual, he's married to a U.S. citizen actually, who is in Maryland, and he was mistakenly identified as someone who's MS-13, that gang, which is a Salvador, well, it's a domestic gang actually, that became named, it was declared a terrorist organization, a foreign terrorist organization, even though MS-13 started in Los Angeles, but it's sort of exported to El Salvador, and so now it's there. But in any case, he's there. And he is not a gang member, and this is the one where I'll say, and the other ones I could say the evidence leads us to believe that they made mistakes. Here, they acknowledge that they made a mistake in court. And the lawyers from the Justice Department who admitted that in court have been fired. So that is in Maryland, and that is up on appeal to the US Supreme Court. And there's been more time granted by the Supreme Court to hear that, so any day now it could happen.
And he still remains in their mega prison.
Yeah, he's in the CCAT, right? Yeah, no due process. So, this is, one of the ones where you say, Carl, I hear you talking about the Fourth Amendment and but what's going on here? Okay.
And he had a green card, and he's been living here since 2011.
Yeah.
So he's a solid resident.
Yeah. And we'll get into the distinction there. I don't know how many of you know a lot about that, so if you guys don't, then just let me breeze through it. But anyway, Ramiza Ozturk. This one's a very, she's a student at Tufts. Okay, so we deal with students at Rush, obviously. She was detained, you probably saw even the video of it, where she was arrested. She had an F1 visa, which is, we'll talk about later, she's a student. That's a student visa. And the basis, at least as far as we know right now, the basis is that she wrote an op-ed in the student paper. The op-ed was critical of Israel, and sympathetic to the Palestinians, and called on Tufts to divest investments in Israel. Okay. So next slide. Sorry,
By the way, she's detained in Louisiana at this point.
She's in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Okay. So she is in American soil. So there's an opportunity then for her to file, and she has. She's contesting it. All these people have contested it. Right? So Mahmoud Khalil is the Columbia University student. Probably all heard about him. and he's back in New Jersey now, right? They moved.
Louisiana.
Oh, he's in. I thought he went back. Okay, so I think what they did is they granted him the opportunity to have his proceeding held in New Jersey. Right. But in any case, he's that student protest leader from Columbia. Again, potential. See here it says the U.S. revoked his lawful permanent resident status. So again, he had a lawful permanent resident, much like the green card. That allows for deportation, but it allows for deportation if an individual is deemed to potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. So I can only piece this together, and it'll come out in the court case, that because he was a student protest leader, that was deemed to be a potentially serious foreign policy consequence. I know we sit here and we think of America, First Amendment. Okay, so then I'll skip this one. Here's the last one here is this, the Boasberg case, Judge Boasberg, you probably heard of, he's the DC District Court Judge. There's a class action that was filed in the DC District Court for a number of people who were taken, who were Venezuelan, but are they immigrants from Venezuela, but I don't know their status in terms of visas or non-visas or undocumented.
I think they're all varied.
It varied, yeah. It was just, but the key connective tissue for the government was that they were all members of Tren de Aragua. They alleged that they were members of it. Because we know, at least they have not admitted it yet, but there are several of them have shown evidence that say that they're not. For instance, there's one gay hairdresser who had tattoos that they mistook, or he's alleging they mistook or whatever. This one is where the use of the Alien Enemies Act has been used, which I'll talk a little bit about, to, I don't want to say deport, because these people didn't come from El Salvador. They were relocated. Another term for it would be renditioned, right? Which happens in wartime. Moved to this prison in El Salvador, which many of you probably heard about, which is a horrendous case. So these are these cases. I wanted to start with them before we talked a little bit about what the process is and the law, because I'll come back to these cases and we can talk a little bit about the cases. Okay, so again, crash course immigration, just so we're on the same page. Variety of ways that people can have a visa. A lot of them are tied to either being a student or being an employee. So employers are engaged in the work on this because employers need people to help do the work, and sometimes American citizens, they don't have enough American citizens to choose from. So there are immigrant visas that are granting permanent residency status, and then there are non-immigrant visas, which are temporary, okay? So let's go to immigrant visas. So these are people who seek to permanently live in the US. They will apply for a green card and also eventually citizenship. So I think Garcia falls into that category, right? An IR1, we don't need to go all through the details, but he's a spouse, and that's Garcia. He was a spouse. So he holds a immigrant visa, green card, leads to permanent residency, which is secured after the visa allows entry, and then your permanent residency is approved. You eventually apply for U.S. citizenship, usually requires a sponsor, so an employer, and then it takes a considerable amount of time. And this will wind up in the naturalization process, right? Which you went through back in the day. And so that's the immigrant visas. Now here's the non-immigrant visas, which most of the people we were talking about in all those cases are non-immigrant. Not Garcia, he's an immigrant visa, but non-immigrant visa. Okay, so these are people who are seeking to temporarily visit, study, or work in the United States. And you hear a lot about these. I have to deal with all these. There's F1 student visa, right? Ozturk, that woman from Tufts. H1B, so the Lebanese doctor from Brown, that's a temporary skilled worker. And then there's other classifications. It does not lead to a green card. So you're not there, you're not saying that you're there, you want to be permanent, you're there for a specific purpose and temporary, but it could change. Right? You could convert it to a path to citizenship. It's time limited, of course. You're there for the employment work that you're doing or for the school, and then it's tied to a specific activity. Okay.
And you need to apply for extensions if it meets the expiration.
Right, and when we get to practical consequences, like for you guys and anybody you're talking to and maybe have concerned people in your world, whether that you manage or you work with or whatever, important to keep your documentation up to date. Now, obviously you see those cases, you're like, is that even right? Look, the way I look at the law is at this point in time is no own goals, right? You got to do everything you can to make sure that they don't have any hook to hang you up on. Doesn't mean that they're not going to push the limits or even ignore some of the law, but I'm just saying at least don't do things that, that's one bit of advice I give to anybody, is just make sure you have your documentation and it's in good order and you're carrying it around with you, including things like that establish your employment. So here are the relevant government agencies that we're talking about. I'll race through them pretty quickly. Department of Labor is obviously very involved in this when you're talking about employment visas. Citizen and Immigration Services is the administrative arm, the administrative counterpart to ICE. So ICE is the enforcement, sort of like the police officers and the investigators. CIS is the administrative arm of it. And obviously Department of State is involved here when granting the visas, just as they would with granting passports. And Customs and Border Patrol. They're responsible for inspecting and controlling who and what enters the country. The way to think of it is CBP is here at points of entry, border. ICE is operating within the United States. So that's why these individuals are ones who can go into places to do searches, and these are usually at the border or at a port of entry, which could be an airport. Next slide.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. CBP, or Customs and Border Patrol, they basically handle the customs process for international travel. And as a matter of fact, that's really not the limit. In other words, if TSA wants to escalate it up to CBP for any further investigation or what have you, then they can definitely escalate that to CBP, and they'll get engaged in that case, whatever the TSA wants for them to handle. With respect to their general authority, CBP of course deals with the international travel, and TSA, that's more domestic. Of course, you're going to have TSA agents looking through your stuff and having your luggage, for example, go through the X-ray machine. Their sole purpose really is to figure out whether there are any aviation security concerns.
Yeah, what are they looking through your stuff for?
Any kind of weapons, perhaps a firearm.
So it's airplane safety, though.
So airplane safety, right. So that's really the reason why they're going through this process, in order to make sure that you're not carrying anything that might pose a danger to their security. They won't confiscate anything. So meaning their job is not to take stuff away from you. They will tell you you can't bring that in, or they'll tell you to throw something out, but they cannot confiscate, for example, your devices, your laptops, your luggage. They can't do that. But if there is a national security, again, they could always channel it up all the way to CBP, and then they'll get engaged where they do have that authority to confiscate your devices, your laptop, your luggage, or what have you. So other than these very few exceptions, TSA is just relegated to making sure that there are no safety concerns with regard to the flight. Now, the Customs and Border Patrol, they can certainly go into your devices to look for information or data or what have you. And we're gonna go into that. This is their authority, generally speaking. There's been a lot of concerns coming out because of some of the recent cases that we talked about. But generally speaking, they do have that authority to be able to go into your devices without a warrant. Now, when it comes to, and Carl talked about this before regarding that Fourth Amendment protections, unreasonable searches and seizures, where there is reasonable expectation of privacy, right? And these are your things in your possession. And there's some reasonable expectation of privacy there. However, there is this border search exception does not fall under that Fourth Amendment protection.
And it doesn't appear in the Fourth Amendment, right? The Fourth Amendment just simply says no unreasonable search and seizures, but it's been interpreted by the courts as allowing for broader. There's just exceptions that have been carved out.
Right. And how they're gonna justify this is by stating that, well, there's a reasonable suspicion. And by reasonable suspicion, we're talking about their claim to some knowledge about the individual's criminal history, related to smuggling, terrorism, cyber crimes, perhaps suspicious behavior or statements, or some type of an intelligence tip that they might claim they have against an individual. Now, it used to be strictly adhered to with some deference given to the agent looking into this stuff and analyzing the information. I don't know if that's guaranteed anymore. I think that at this point, almost anything can be used as an excuse to claim reasonable suspicion. And that's where we need to be really careful and be aware as travelers what they could potentially do to you.
Yeah.
And
this is where it ties into the First Amendment, because look at that right there. A reasonable suspicion could come from suspicious behavior or statements. Okay, now what is a suspicious statement has, you know, we were talking 2024, I wouldn't have said some of the things that are being viewed that way now. But now this administration views things as suspicious or potentially affecting, if not threatening, national security as statements. So you see this connection between First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, but like you said, you know, there's a reduced protection whenever you're it's close to the border or at these points of entry. There's really reduced protection. So it's just helpful to keep that in mind as a traveler.
What is a suspicious statement? I mean, you know, we have the First Amendment right to free speech. So if they're going to, you know, apply that standard, I think we just need to be really careful as to staying under the radar instead of perhaps, you know, being in their crosshairs. Now, they might treat the citizens differently than the non-citizens and visa holders. Of course, citizens may deny consent to a search, but that could potentially mean that, you know, there'll be extended travel delays. There could be additional investigations. There could be a confiscation of you know, your devices or your possessions. But they cannot deny entry. Right? So that would be applicable for the citizens. However, for the non-citizens or visa holders, deportation is a possibility, detainment and deportation, in addition to everything else. So they need to be really careful with respect to, you know, going through customs. And there's some legal recommendations that we've come up with for our organization and for our staff members in terms of how to look at this and how to address a particular situation when they encounter, you know, CBP during their travel. But they need to be really cognizant of exactly what the potential ramifications may be when they are traveling either internationally or domestically.
Well, like Dr. Alawi, the doctor from Brown, she was traveling in, she was an H-1B visa holder. She had just been in Lebanon at that funeral, and she had pictures on her phone of, right, that they were able to establish. So if it weren't a visa holder, if it were a citizen, would the same thing have happened? Who knows? But one thing is true is that they couldn't have denied a citizen re-entry into the States. They could have still investigated, et cetera, but they'd have to let the person enter. She, being a visa holder, they said, we could deny you entry, and in fact, they also used that as a basis to revoke her H-1B and deport or send her back to Lebanon.
I mean, it's really concerning that they're taking such drastic government action based on what is tantamount to a very thin amount of evidence.
Right.
And that's, of course, that should alarm all of us with respect to, you know, our traveling internationally. So, all right.
So ICE enforces the immigration laws. I think I mentioned that before. Their authority comes from the Immigration Nationality Act, INA, and the Homeland Security Act of 2002. They have two main functions. One's enforcement, so the ERO, which is to identify, arrest, detain, deport individuals, and then they also do customs, which is looking for things that, you know, contraband that shouldn't be smuggled in or whatever. Next slide. ICE can deport non-citizens for unauthorized. This is sort of, we're now, instead of CBP, we're now talking about ICE. So this is, you're in the United States, you're not a citizen, you're either a visa holder or you're undocumented. It could deport non-citizens for unauthorized presence, meaning they illegally came here. They overstayed a visa, so you just weren't in compliance with your visa, or your documentation on visa wasn't in order, and convictions for aggravated felonies and other visa violations. ICE typically prioritizes persons for documentation this way. High priority for our national security threats, terrorism-related public safety threats, border threats. Lower priority for deportation as longtime residents with no criminal record, DACA recipients, and individuals with strong family, community, economic ties. But the prioritization changes with administration. So again, if we were here 2024, I would have told you something different. And in fact, just a couple weeks after the inauguration here in 2025, we did some presentations on this topic. And we were led to believe through the statements that were made that their prioritization was not DACA, was not people who had visas. It wasn't. They really were going after undocumented people, and even with undocumented people, it was only undocumented people that had charges against them or convictions. That's what they said at that time. It didn't hold. It started to fit more into this, and then in order, like you were saying, David, national security threats, terrorism related, and public safety threats. Those two in particular are what they've kind of leaned on. ICE has leaned on as a basis for most of the cases I was talking about, that they're national security, or the Alien Enemies Act, which kind of fits into the same, right? Alien Enemies Act says, well, let's go to that slide. Oh no, first we're going to talk due process. I already mentioned this. Due process rights under the Fifth Amendment applies to all persons, not just citizens. Okay, so that means the visa holders, the undocumented people, anybody has due process rights under the Fifth Amendment. So all of us have a right to fair procedures, notice, opportunity to respond, a hearing before an impartial judge. That's what due process means, right? Sort of slows things down and gives some order and clarity to it, we hope. That's the whole point of due process, through court proceedings or some sort of administrative proceeding if you're a visa holder. So visa holders have due process protections as well, and they go to immigration court hearings if facing deportation. They have more limited rights at the border. One thing I want to note is that the violations of some of these laws for visa holders or undocumented people are not even criminal acts, they're civil statutes. And so that, again, lowers the threshold for the government, because if you're being prosecuted for criminal acts, you have a lot more protection, any person, citizen or otherwise. But if it's a civil act, you're not as protected. And so by classifying these things as civil actions or civil statutes, it gives the government a lot more leeway. And that predates 2025. That's just the way it's always been. Undocumented persons themselves are even entitled to removal hearings and access to immigration judge. There are exceptions to all this, as there often are, and that is near the border area. What is the mileage? It's like within, I forget, it's a certain number of miles from the border. Again, they're back to that terrorism, national security cases, and that these are making exceptions. So now let's go to the next slide. I think it's the final slide on talking about the law here. This act. So this act, I talked to you about it before, about where it's only been used in times of declared war. But you see, here's the language of it. It's a declared war or any threatened, attempted, or actual invasion or predatory incursion. And this is what the administration is using. There wasn't a declared war, but Trendagua, MS-13, these are terrorist organizations. They've been defined as such. And then he's characterizing, that's why you've heard them say things like, well, they're invading. It's an invasion for it. Well, it's coming from this. They're not pulling this out of thin air. They're pulling it out of this act. So there's been a lot of thought given to the fact of resuscitating this act, which again hasn't been used since World War II. And look at that. It applies specifically to nationals of enemy countries, so people who are not citizens of this country, but undocumented or visa holders from another country. The other country being a country they've designated as one that is an invasive force or national security threat. And it gives the president broad discretion, and great deference is given to his decisions by courts. So if you were going to use an act to kind of push the boundaries of due process or even ignore due process, it would be this one. Okay, he invoked it, as we know. He relocated. That was the justification for the Trendagua relocations. The U.S. Supreme Court just ruled on this just the other day, but it didn't rule on whether or not the Alien Enemies Act is constitutionally being used right now. It avoided that question. All it did is it narrowly kept it to that if someone wants to challenge that detention or a relocation, they've got to do it through a habeas petition. And once they are detained, they have to be given notice and afforded a hearing. That's what the justices said in the opinion. And interestingly, Justice Kavanaugh said, he wrote a concurrence, because I think he really wanted to go on the record as saying in a paragraph, this only relates to venue. Meaning, so it's legal speak for, these people still have rights. They still have to be given notice and they have to be given hearing. And all we're saying is it has to go to the right venue. And what does that mean? It means in that Trendagua case, the DC District Court was not the venue because those people weren't detained in DC. They were in Texas or wherever. And so that's where the case had to be brought. So essentially it was almost like a technical violation. It was like, go back. But that allowed them, the Supreme Court to not address the main issue, which is the Alien Enemies Act being used properly here? Because if you talk to many legal scholars and authorities, they would say you can only, well, it's the statute itself. It says declared war or an invasion. What does an invasion mean? Does it mean a gang that's trying to do drugs, smuggle drugs here or whatever? If that's the case, we got a lot of invasions going on any day of the week, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, unfortunate and, not something we want, but does it call upon the use of this? An act that was done because people were scared of France, this is back in 1798, going to war with the United States, and then Britain with war with the United States in the War of 1812. So, you could look at this, and if I were, I'm just being hypothetical, if I were a judge, and I think most judges are going to say this, I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to rule. I'd say, well, there's no war going on. Because before the Congress, I would assume, or a judge would give the president this kind of authority, there has to be a real emergency going. It can't just be, I've decided that those people that are coming in here dealing drugs are an invading force and we're declaring war on them. That's a lot. It's a lot of power to be given to an individual for something like that, which is something that happens every day of the week and every year. It's an unfortunate thing that happens, but it's handled usually through basic law enforcement, right? Police, FBI, etc.
I mean, it's executed during the time of war, and it specifies that this would apply against an enemy country. So is El Salvador an enemy country?
Well, clearly not, because they're using the El Salvadoran prison.
Right.
So it's not an enemy country.
Exactly. So there is a lot to be analyzed with respect to whether or not this is being properly used by the Supreme Court.
But you see a lot of the countries that are the people, their nationality, their background. Venezuela, he has talked about Venezuela being a country that is not an acceptable country from foreign policy standpoint of the United States. It's what's going on in the Middle East now. So Iran now is being, why I'm saying that is that, the groundwork sometimes gets laid for how we talk about where people are coming from based upon articulations that they're hostile to us or that they're foreign, terrorist states, or, and look, I think, from my personal opinion on it, if we are legitimately at war, which I think requires a congressional declaration of war, or there's a terrorist incident and we actually have real threats of terrorism, you could get your head around the idea that we have to take more expeditious action against people who are really posing a threat. But is someone writing an op-ed posing a threat? Is a man married to a woman who's a citizen of the United States and he's a green card holder and mistaken is that a threat? The answer is of course not. So hopefully as these cases make their way through the courts, that will be recognized. But what we're waiting for as lawyers, and all citizens are waiting for, and non-citizens are waiting for, is for the court to articulate, is this being used properly? Are these, we're not there yet. Now we're dealing with a lot of technical, if pardon my expression, technical aspects of it. Is it in the right venue? Do they use a habeas petition instead of a class action, which is what was being used in DC? Okay, once we sort through all that and we landed on the right process and the right rules and procedures, what's really going on here? Is this really a law that should be being invoked right now? Should people be not deported even, relocated based upon supposition and not without due process? I think all of us as Americans would say no. Even as detestable as someone might be because of their gang affiliate, let's say it's proven. Okay, but then in a due process environment, you'd suss that out, you'd figure that out and say, okay, that person doesn't belong here because they actually have committed crimes and they are a threat to national security or whatever. But you don't just sweep up people like that. So this indiscriminate way that's happening is giving a lot of people justifiably a lot of concern. And as lawyers, we're very concerned because in addition to that, we're concerned about the process breaking down, not being respected. Because once you have no rules, and people like to make fun of bureaucracy and rules, but you don't have any rules, you're in a very scary place, right? You're in a very scary place.
So that's part of our job, is to make sure that we keep our eyes and ears open to see what's coming out from these court cases and from the government, so that we're ready to come out with or amend any plans that we might currently have at this point.
So just to be respectful of everybody's time, because I know there's other things that you guys want to get to and question answers. The last piece, I think, David, I don't think we want to go through everything else, but maybe just the practical realities, sort of things that we've been telling people. We've already been dropping some of this to you guys, but
so as it, starting from January, as these executive orders were coming out, We needed to do some immediate think tank sessions to come up with, what is our legal perspective on this, and how can we better, our organization, protect our organization, our institutions, and its staff members. We have staff members who are on visas, and they have certain types of visa status. We have students at Rush University with F1 and DACA applications in place, and so we needed to come together to figure out how we're going to address all of these really complex issues, not knowing exactly what's going to come out around the corner. So we came up with some really important essentials, really, for us to look through and make sure we have. We needed a strong policy to address this particular situation, to protect our institution and staff members. Whenever the ICE agents or US CIS members will come to do some kind of an I-9 investigation, or to start digging into employee files, and also our patients as well. We are a healthcare institution. Our mission as an organization is to provide healthcare. It's not about whether they have certain legal statuses. That's not our concern. It's more about making sure that every individual that comes through our door has their patient's rights protected to the fullest extent, right? So we needed to make sure that there's a policy that's going to safeguard that right. We realized it should have an easy escalation plan. So it can't be complicated where our staff members wouldn't understand exactly how to approach it. So you needed to be clear. There needs to be an escalation plan that will involve the appropriate amount of individuals to get engaged as they might be conducting an I-9 investigation or deportation rates. And that we thought is security leads, property managers, operational leads, legal for sure, and depending on whether or not it's an I-9 investigation, human resources as well. Legal should have a definite role, because again, we talked about Fourth Amendment. Carl has really greatly expounded on this in terms of the Fourth Amendment protections. We're not talking about the border exception here, because they are all present here in the country. We're not talking about the border ends where those exceptions might apply. But because they're here, the Fourth Amendment protections are guaranteed, and it applies to everyone, not just citizens, right? So legal is going to then intervene to make sure that Fourth Amendment protections are safeguarded, meaning they're going to make sure that if there is going to be a search and possible seizure of individuals, that it's done appropriately based on what the legal standard is. And by that, what I mean is we're looking at whether or not there is in fact a search warrant, right, and an arrest warrant that is signed by a judge within a 14-day window where that warrant needs to be executed. And that it's not just some paperwork that is signed by an immigration judge or signed by an immigration official like an ICE agent, that it is in fact judicially approved based on some information that they might have. And that's what we're here to sort of flesh out, to make sure that it is legitimate. And if it is not legitimate, we're going to push back, right? Push back to the extent that we're allowed to. And of course, we talked about a potential ramification of physically intervening that could lead to a potential arrest for obstruction. If they claim injury, for example, the agents claim injury, that could mean incarceration up to 20 years. And so we're looking at the potential ramifications of that, and saying we don't want to have our staff members involved in any kind of physical altercation. I think there's a better way to handle this, which is to express things like, we do not give consent to a search, you don't have the necessary paperwork, you need to come back, and also allowing security to be involved in that process with respect to making sure that they're protecting the institution and the patients and the visitors from unwarranted intrusion. But basically, there should be that clear escalation process that gets disseminated as information, as part of the education around this whole issue to the organization, so that they're clear in exactly how to approach it when an ICE agent does show up.
We should move a little bit just because this is
Yeah.
what I said, but like
So-
just some tips that I think that people who here might benefit from include, like we were talking about when you're traveling,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah, let's talk about traveling, right? So I think it's really important to always carry your passport and visas that are updated. It's important to make sure that you're in touch with the local resources, and we're gonna talk about what those are very quickly. But get in touch with the available resources. And of course, these are resources that are available to anyone who wants it. But they should get in touch with them so that they can update their paperwork and make sure that they're carrying that around. Especially when you're traveling, you don't know nobody knows exactly how they're gonna be approached with respect to proving up exactly who they are and why they're, trying to enter into the US. So having that paperwork, I think is gonna be really crucial, right? If you are a medical professional and you might be carrying some sensitive information, like the HIPAA-protected medical records or patient information, those are protected under HIPAA. And so every healthcare professional has an obligation, a duty to protect that information, right? And so it's always important that they're pushing back, engaging in that process where they're escalating it up, making sure that they're alerted to the fact that there is some protected information within their devices, making sure that they're escalating within their own chain of commands so that the appropriate individuals are reviewing the need for any kind of intrusion into your devices that contain those types of records, right? Also, I think it's really important that if there's a privacy officer at the institution, that they're immediately notified of a potential breach. Because if they're going into the device, right, without your consent, because there's some reasonable suspicion based on, who knows what, then there's a potential for breach of that information. So the privacy officer does need to be kept apprised of exactly what is going on. We were also coming up with other recommendations like keeping sensitive information in the cloud rather than directly in the device itself or your laptop. So that with certain type of passcodes, the recommendation is 6+ alphanumerical codes, instead of using biometrics like your face or your fingerprint, because those have less protections, right? The alphanumerical codes have higher protections with respect to their ability and their authority to actually get into that data and access it. So there's that recommendation that we have provided to our community in terms of, rather than having the information in the device, keeping it in the cloud, but if you did, making sure that there's strong protections around it. And we also say, consider not traveling with those types of devices where it has that information. Maybe if there's any way to get around that, that's the best way to protect that information. So,
and keep your devices clean too. So it's a good policy personally to regularly clear out messages and it's just good for your devices, but it also had the added advantage that there isn't a lot of stuff on them that can be, reviewed.
Right.
So,
and if you're turning off your devices before the inspection, that also, again, if it's not going to have some biometric access, it's going to have additional protections, right? You can push back a little bit.
yeah.
All right. The one thing that we thought was really helpful was, first of all, having an attorney, right? Having an attorney while you're traveling.
You should always travel with an attorney.
Yeah,
having somebody in mind or resources in mind, and again, to the extent you guys are managing teams or with organizations, we have a list of some resources that you could utilize and draw upon. But it's helpful to have that stuff, obviously, but not everybody does. And so that's just a reality. The one thing I want to skip to, David, so then we can go to questions, is all of this again sounds fine and good, but at the end of the day, and as clear as we're saying the law should be and could be, and as much as we want everybody here and everybody we talk to believe in it and honor it, there are people who aren't. And they're pushing, the best that could be said about how they're doing some of these things in these immigration procedures is pushing the limits on statutes that haven't been used in decades. And, hopefully we'll get clarity from courts on it, but the day-to-day for a lot of people is that they're doing this. And so, we could say things, and you probably said to yourself, like, stay under the radar, don't say anything, it's a horrible place to be living in if you're, in the land of the free, supposedly, right? But that's a practical reality. It just sort of is. And it's obviously certain types of statements and certain types of things that people are engaged in, protests, et cetera, are more meaningful to this administration than others. Every one of the ones, not everyone, but a lot of the cases that we mentioned before, it was, and the visa revocations we're seeing for students relate to anti-Israel statements or pro-Palestinian statements. That seems to be the main thing that's kind of going on, aside from the Tren de Agua issues and that kind of thing. So, which isn't as tied to First Amendment, but when it comes to those kind of communications, look, I say this to my own clients. I'm not telling anybody, don't believe in what you believe in, say what you believe. I'm a huge believer in the First Amendment. I'm a huge believer in political speech in particular, because a lot of that stuff that we're talking about is political, can be and should be political speech. But the reality is there's risks. There's risks that the law should be there to protect, but right now we live in a very uncertain time. And so it's just helpful to be mindful of that stuff, I got law firms that I used to work at, we're getting EOs named, where basically it's for no other reason than they represented somebody that was at odds with the administration. It's a frightening time, and it's silly to not say that. But the realities are, you have to be aware of them, gauge the risks, the people that you're responsible for and that you manage and you work with, same thing, just have them, gauge the risks. And I think given the time and stuff, we'll stop there and see if there's any questions or any comments. Yeah.
It's kind of a two-parter. One, this has been enlightening and frightening at the same time.
Don't bring lawyers to a party.
It seems like this all goes to the Supremes. When do you foresee that we'll start to see a significant number of these major cases going to the Supreme Court? And second part, which I've bounced off of friends who are lawyers, a couple of judges. Here's this scenario where the executive branch does something and the Supreme Court rules, no, you can't. And then the executive branch just says, I'm doing it anyway. How do you think it'll play out?
So, yeah, first part is, I think that it will take some time, but not many months. I think these cases will get within the next couple months, they will get there. For instance, the Garcia case that's the guy from Maryland who's married, and right? That is pending before the Supreme Court. They've just extended the time in which parties have to respond to it. So I think they're waiting for the government to fully respond. So that could come at any point. And if they address some of these issues we're talking about, we'll have clarity right there. What it seems to me, often what the Supreme Court, continue to answer that first part, often what courts do, but especially the Supreme Court does, and especially the Roberts Supreme Court, is to really narrowly address the issue because they don't want to make broad pronouncements for a variety of reasons. It's generally a judicial rule of thumb to only address the narrow issue that's in front of you. Don't go any bigger than that. But also, I think they're a little, I'm just guessing, purely guessing, this isn't even a very professional guess. I'm just saying, maybe they're a little concerned that if they come down against it, what will the administration do? They shouldn't be thinking that way, but I don't know. That could be affecting them. But these cases all do call into question the extent, to your point, of the executive branch's power. And at some point in the next couple months, they're going to rule on that. And if they rule in a way that the administration likes, then we're all stuck with it, right? If they don't, then that's the second part of your question. then we are legitimate. People throw around constitutional, crisis a lot these days, and I understand it because you have, if you look at some of this stuff, one could come to the logical conclusion, and in my sense, valid conclusion, that laws are being broken by an executive branch. How can you have that? That is a constitutional crisis in its own. But the ultimate constitutional crisis is exactly what you said. Supreme Court says this is the limits of the executive branch power. President can't do any more than that, and then he does. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I mean, because now I will say that the Supreme Court and any court has the authority to enforce its own orders. It does that through the U.S. Marshals, but it can deputize any law enforcement authority to help. And I mean, it's crazy that we're even talking about this, but some courts will have to think about that in order to enforce an order by a defiant executive branch, they may have to utilize that force to enforce it. I mean, we are in such uncharted territory. It's never happened before. So I don't know. I mean, it's actually, I take that back. It happened at least once. That was the case of when President Andrew Jackson, I'm gonna get this wrong, so I'm gonna just speak as generally as I can about it because I'm not specifically recollecting it. But President Jackson disregarded a court case that dealt with the Cherokee Indians and the enforcement of, or the prevention of the removal from Georgia, I believe it was. This is the Trail of Tears. They didn't enforce the order at a federal level and so allowed the state to do what it was doing. And that enabled there to be the relocation. Gosh, it's very close. I mean, there's similarities. Relocation of the Cherokee Nation. And we all know, well, at least we generally know what happened there, which was, we displaced a whole nation of people. So it doesn't have I guess the answer to your question is there's only one time I can think of that this has happened. And the other time where the law was truly suspended was in the Civil War, when President Lincoln did suspend habeas corpus. But there was an actual war going on then, and it was a civil war. And it was a war that, at the time, we can look back on it and say he did the right thing, but it's hard to kind of like think about some of that stuff and the extent. But when you're in actual wartime, to say nothing of a civil war, exigent circumstances do allow for, you can get your head around the laws being maybe viewed differently for a period of time. This goes back to a principle the Romans had, which was a state of exception, a state of emergency, where they would suspend the law for a period of time, put a dictator in place, literally for 1 year. They had 1 year term and that was it, to address the Civil War or the famine or whatever, and then he would go back and the Republic would start up again. But we all know how that ended too, because one of those consuls was Julius Caesar, and he ended up becoming a dictator, and then it led to the empire. So, there's a lot of history going on, but we live in those times. We live in those times. So, the answer to your question is we don't know. And as I said, the one time that I'm recollecting that it did happen, it did not end well for a whole group of people, a nation of people.
So essentially, wait for the Netflix movie to come out.
We're living in, they say, may you live in interesting times. I don't want to live in interesting times anymore, guys.
I think in terms of where our work regards, I'm with Westside United, struggling with the reconciliation of not complying in advance and then also staying under the radar.
Yeah.
So I guess how are you approaching that?
It's a great question. And because I don't know how many of you are with Westside United. Is everybody somewhat familiar with it, or no, just a couple? Yeah. So you guys are still part of Rush. So and so I don't mind saying like that. Rush has, at least to date, I'm going to go back to the start of this. DEI, we're standing on those principles. A lot of schools have gotten rid of all of that stuff. I have counseled our leaders and even our board that we don't need to. The law is like, it's even by Trump's own statements, it's unlawful DEI. Okay, so then to answer your question, be as meticulous and precise as you can be about the way that you talk about things and think about things. Like for instance, with DEI, I've said make sure that we're not using race as a factor or any protected characteristic as a factor in admissions or scholarships, but we have affinity groups, We have educational offerings. We have all sorts of programs that celebrate, educate, help people to understand different groups of people. And that is lawful, as long as it's open to everybody, right? Those are like, even an affinity group. You got an African American affinity group and somebody wants to join that's not African American, you got to be able to allow them to do that. Sounds a little counterintuitive, but given what the Supreme Court has said about it, and given how you can get your head around, that's the law. But forgive me for taking a silver lining in it. It could be that if we do that the right way and we are precise and that we still have these things, and more people are involved and more people are aware of them. I think it's an opportunity. Don't kill me for this, but an opportunity for greater education about all this stuff, because you just can't be imprecise in how you're dealing with it when you're dealing with a time like that. What did I say earlier? I said no own goals. That's a mantra I keep saying to myself. Like, we can't give them anybody on the outside an easy way to say, ha, you did that, so we're shutting the whole thing down or whatever, or we're depriving you of $400 million. We don't even have that much money. But like what happened to Columbia, $400 million in grant money. So was it more than that? It's more. But Northwestern just got hit with 753. Yeah. So it's a lot of money at stake that they could put at issue, which is so wrong, obviously both ethically and I would say legally. But we have to get through the court process to see how that's going to shake out. And it's not like, I will say this, it's not like the administration or like NIH, for instance, has canceled some grants, right? They have been reinstated in places. And we just appealed one at Rush. And the way that we talked about it was that it's not diversity in the way that you're thinking of it. It's not that we're putting one racial group or ethnic group ahead of another or giving them advantages other people. We're just tracking data. And we want to see how it affects it. We can't live in a lie, right? The world there are different outcomes for different types of people for a variety of reasons, right? So that's a really long-winded way of saying continue to pursue your goals and your missions, but check in with that lawyer that David said you should be traveling with all the time. But we still work with you and represent you. So we're available to work with you guys to make sure that, and I'm doing that with the admissions group, with the university, with our DEI leader. We have two, Princess Currents and Ilda Morrow. We're talking with them. I did a whole dense slide deck on DEI that I'm gonna be rolling out and talking to people about. Because I, just like all of you, believe in the importance of diversity and importance of pursuing that as a goal. We just have to do it lawfully now. Now, we're taking them at their word when they say there's unlawful DEI and there's lawful DEI. But that's the best I can do right now, right? That's the best we can do right now. And so as long as we, but like when we're doing one on the, if you don't mind me talking about Alzheimer's Research Center, right? You can't study that disease without accounting for genetic differences in people. And the genetic differences do align with ethnic differences, racial differences, et cetera. So we are articulating to the government, like, look, here's how you have to do medical science. Here's how you have to do research. Health equity. There are gaps. Are those gaps due to the fact that some people are Hispanic in South Lawndale, African American in North Lawndale? Like, we don't know. We need to do the research to understand that, number one. Number two, even if we do the research or not, there still are these gaps. How are we gonna bridge them? It doesn't, now what I've talked to our leadership about, and I talked to you guys about, is like, it doesn't matter whether, it could be geographically based or socioeconomically based. I've been hearing people that, not, for the record, not as a proxy for race, right? It's just that in that zone, in that area of the city, in that community, there are health disparities. Are they related to ethnic? We may not know. That's not the point. The point is when we're delivering care, it's a reality. We got to bridge that gap. And there are black people who live at, David Ansell's book where he's like the L line. It's it's a factual, right? Here you got people living to 80. Over here you got people living to 80. Here you got people living less than 7. It happens to be that it aligns up, with different ethnic groups and racial groups, but it doesn't matter. Meaning the health disparities are there. We have to address them. And so we, as a charitable nonprofit, as Westside United will be, but is as well, effectively, has a charter and a mission to do that. So we have to take care of it. So if our way of doing that is to say that that geographic location, that socioeconomic group, which are not, what I didn't talk about was what are not protected characteristics versus protected characteristics. Not protected characteristics, meaning characteristics that we can consider when we're talking about where to devote resources, are things like socioeconomic disparities in background, geographic disparities in background, right? Those kinds of things. And so when you look at it that way, there's no, David Ansel and I have talked about it many times, like there's no escaping it. So we have to do something about it, right? And there isn't a basis in the law to stop that from happening. And if they try to stop that from happening, we will do our best through the courts to stop them from stopping that from happening. And that's the basic pledge I can. But everything I'm saying, when I look at the Supreme Court case and I look at the law, we're staying within the law. We're staying, look, like I say, okay, Justice Roberts, you issued that ruling in the Harvard case. We respect it. I'm not the type of person who storms the Capitol, who's like when I don't get what I want. We didn't get what we wanted necessarily, maybe, but we got the law. Okay, now we're going to execute on that. We still can, and we still can deliver on the goals that all of you guys are trying to pursue. We are too, with health equity and equity generally, but staying within the bounds of law. We just have to be precise about it. And so we're here to help.
Not so much a question, but kind of in terms of what we just said, it's compliance, right? So we work for a nonprofit financial institution, Self-Help Federal Credit Union. And as an organization, we are in underserved communities where we're at the crosshairs of what's happening right now with immigration. And one of the things that the residual effects of what's happening right now, the wheels of justice are fairly slow.
Yes.
And what we're seeing right now is the impact in communities where individuals are not coming out, as they would.
Yeah.
I'm in Little Village, for example. We're seeing businesses where there's been drop off of upwards of 60%, and so the residual effects of that, finances are affected. Obviously, the economy in our community, in our city as a whole. What I'm seeing quite a bit as well is nonprofit organizations that are reliant on funding sources, right? Whether it be state or federal government, that are really finding a very difficult time trying to figure out exactly how to navigate these waters, right? So again, not so much a question as one, being thankful for the opportunity to have this conversation, but also thinking through building those alliances like the one that we have to really meet those needs of those organizations, because we're really gonna find basically that if it was bad before, it's gonna be worse right now, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, so again, just trying to figure out how to navigate again in these situations for those small organizations that, I'm part of a larger organization that, we can call our legal department and we can call our general counsel, and, Rush is a huge organization, but then there are the little
These
guys.
little ones, yeah.
I'm part of organizations that have operating budgets of $1-2 million, or less than that.
Right.
In some cases, and they're the ones that are really at odds right now with everything that's
Yeah, no, I'm sure, and I'm affiliated, I'm the chair of the board of the Healthy Communities Foundation, which is out in west side and the western suburbs, and they're seeing that with a lot of the organizations, the small organizations that we help fund out of that trust, that they are they're scared, they're uncertain, they don't have the resources to have the so I think it's important, and maybe it's incumbent upon all of us to get the word out. And here, back to your question and what you just said about compliance and complying with it. There's a way of being both compliant with the law. I just described some of it, right? There's more to it, but I described some of the broad parameters of how we can still stay within the law. So like, we're being good soldiers, we're being good Americans, and we're following the law. We're still pursuing our ends, but communicating that to the community at large more, so they're not as scared, because there is a way to do these. It's almost like now I'm sure people are thinking, boy, am I doing the right, like we're doing something illegal. Like, no, you're not. As long as you, like David said about, when we were talking about tips on immigration and traveling and stuff, there's ways of legally, approaching it and doing it, but being careful, cognizant of the practical realities, but still staying within the law. And I think that, it's a combination of, so there is still compliance. It's not compliance in advance. We're complying with what we know to be the law and how we, good faith, are interpreting it. But we're not guessing at what some vague pronouncement means. We're complying with what we know. And I think we need to do a better job, and this is on us too, of communicating to people that you can be compliant and still, and the other thing I'd add to that, not be adversarial. So like, I'm not there sticking my, doing this to the Trump administration. We may want to, someone may want to, but I don't think that gets me anywhere, right? Certainly not my job. Other people have different roles in society and approaches, but I don't. My role is to, look, follow the law. It makes sense, not just legally, but it makes sense from an ethical standpoint, from a scientific standpoint. The data drives it that way. And I think the more people maybe that hear that, they'll feel a little bit more comfortable and they come out of the shadows a little bit. I mean, I'm being Pollyanna here, but I don't know. I gotta have some silver lining, man. And so when I look at it, I think that the more that we do these things, now that I'm thinking about it, the more we have these things in forums where maybe we invite, right? Like, so the agencies that get funded by Healthy Communities or your agency and the ones you work with, we have broader discussions where, look, there's nothing I'm saying here that I don't care. I don't care who hears it. Like, I'm not saying anything. I'm not thumbing my nose at the administration. Look, they've got their agenda. They're pursuing it. We're within the bounds of the law as we understand it, are trying to pursue ours. And it's not, and these things are not illegal. And more people need to hear that. Because all we're hearing right now is what either seems like it's illegal or we should be careful of or whatever, and not what we can be pursuing legally. And so I think there's just more messaging that needs to get out there.
I think we're over time.
Sorry about